So we're going to be covering quite a bit of information here. So I'll be using the room very much to say, okay, Ross, stop geeking out, move on to the next slide here. We will get into, because really with me, I like to know the how. I like to know the why behind why things are happening. So at certain points, we might dive into some of the physiology or some of the science behind it, but I'm going to try to, make it as quick as possible or as relevant as possible as we kind of go along our talk here. So, and another aspect that I want to show is when I was going through a lot of this information I was relying off Dale Bredesen or the Bredesen Protocol. Some of you might be aware of the Recode Protocol. And if you're aware of that, a lot of it isn't earth-shattering things. It's really sticking to the foundations. It's owning the foundations and addressing a whole conglomerate or multifactorial issues instead of addressing one individual issue, which you'll become akin to as we proceed in our talk today. So real quick, just to give you an idea of what we're going to be covering, we're going to be covering what does it mean to age, what's the difference between biological aging versus chronological aging. We'll be talking about some neuroexcitotoxicity and its effect on cognitive decline. We'll be talking very briefly about the gut-brain connection, how that's influenced there. And then I always try to put myself in the viewer's seat. I always want to go home with some take-home, some takeaways. What can I do that I can leave and actually implement that very next day? So we'll get started. Okay, so I wish I could say we could turn back the clock here. That's something we're not going to be able to do. So I don't want to be selling you snake oil here. We're not going to be doing that. But we're going to talk about aspects. What does it mean to age from a biological standpoint? I think you all know what it means to chronologically age. Where as we increase, we decide to put a categorical number on where we are in our stage in our life. I always like to make sure it puts me in such a good position when I hear someone, I ask, how old are you? And they go, I'm 40 years young or 65 years young. I just like that phrase. I think that's how we should approach age in general. My little quirk there. But anyways, what's it mean to age from a biological standpoint? So all of these factors here, DNA remodeling or DNA splicing, telomere length or telomere shortening, gene methylation, chromatin remodeling, decreased stem cell production, histone modification, the unfolding or misfolding of proteins, mitochondrial damage, oxidative stress, and more. All of these factors are compounded together, and that's kind of what our biological aging is. And actually, Dr. Dale Bredesen in his research has found that there's over 36 factors and then some still being discovered in the connection to Alzheimer's. As you'll see on the next page here, these are the factors. I've decided to lay them out all in chronological order, and I'm going to read them all right now. No. So as you can see, if we decide to just take one of these, if I just want to focus on reduced NF-kappa B, we're missing the mark. We still have, 36, tons and tons of physiological aspects that we need to address here. And what Recode and what we've kind of modeled as well in our practice here, we're dealing with dementia or mild cognitive impairment or severe cognitive impairment issues, is making sure how do we encapsulate all of this without overwhelming, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So here's the thing here, and I kind of put it into Aaron's face. It's just like, what did you just put? So this is my thinking. I rather have my brain and have decreased motor skills. The last thing I want is to be able to still move and be a zombie. I want my brain, I want it to be sharp. That's the most important aspect. So the ultimate goal here, avoiding being a zombie. We want our brain, we cherish our brain. So that was the whole point there. Thought a good visual to drive it home. Okay, so we have 5 fundamental steps to maintaining healthy aging. We're maintaining good synaptogenesis. So these 5 steps that we're going to focus on will be, number 1, addressing inflammation and infections. Okay, so these 5 steps are the most important aspects to address here. So this is the highlight of anything. If you take anything home, it's these 5 aspects to address.
Before you send these out as a link with the presentation, are you
Yep.
going to do that?
So this will be all on YouTube after this. So if you'd like, you can forward, rewind through YouTube, jot down notes. So no, it's fine. We're gonna make sure. Yep, exactly. So number 1, addressing inflammation and infections. We're going to talk about that in detail, but we're just highlighting the 5 key points. Number 2, addressing insulin resistance and gut health, the gut-brain connection. I can't stress that enough. So real quick, I'm not going to be able to give enough attention to it because we'll be here all day, but really important. So the gut has a microbiome. That microbiome will feed directly into what's called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve travels up into the brainstem and actually communicates with the brain. That's why the vagus nerve plays into parasympathetic. So when we're nice and full and satiated, that's when we're in parasympathetic state because we're activating the vagus nerve. We've just had food. We don't need to hunt anymore. We can relax, and it stimulates the vagus nerve and talks to the brain. So the fact that we actually have a physical connection from stomach to brain is pretty powerful. So what we've put in our stomach affects our brain very much so. Next. Number 3, hormone and nutrient depletion. This one kind of threw me through a loop. I was like, well, how does hormone and nutrients really, mainly hormones, I mean, I understand nutrients, how does that really play into aging, into correct brain development? And I'll dive into that later, and it really makes some powerful connections there. Number 4, toxin exposure, making sure that we're aware of this, we're removing any harmful toxins, okay? We'll dive into that. Number 5, loss of neuronal and synaptic connections. This one's the hardest one to take care of. A lot of the other 4 aspects, I feel like with some just correct guidance, those are pretty good things that patients can go home with some correct guidance and really own. This is one of the aspects that definitely needs some practitioner handheld holding. Next. Okay, so now for the next couple minutes, this is where I kind of nerd out and I enjoy this aspect. So what does it mean to have neuronal loss? What happens? What's that process look like? What's going on here? So what we're going to talk about here is the excitotoxic model. So neuroexcitotoxicity from glutamate. And real quick, what you'll realize is glutamate can cause the neurons to self-destruct. And I want to talk about, so I don't forget, one of the approved FDA Parkinson drugs, which was recently, it's the most recent approved Parkinson drug in 2003, was the memantine. It actually is a glutamate transmission inhibitor. So this model I'm talking about, it actually inhibits this model from happening. So that kind of just emphasizes the point of this. So we have a neuron. We have its dendrites here, and then the axon down here, which transmits a signal. These kind of link up and they keep connecting more neurons, and that's how we send a signal. So really important here, we have an astrocyte. An astrocyte releases glutamate, glycine, and glutathione, your master antioxidant protector in the brain. So what happens is the glutamate gets released into the neuron. The neuron causes it to, I'm going to have to turn that off. It's going to really bother me. I apologize. Alexa, turn off radio. Okay, it's off, right? Okay. So, okay, now I can focus. I'm like, "Arr." Okay, so point here, astrocyte releases glutamate. Glutamate causes basically the cell to become excited. It causes the cell to release calcium. So this is kind of how you want to think about it. The resting state of the neuron is negative. It wants to have a negative charge. Calcium comes in and makes it positive. It excites it. So, glutamate comes in, triggers calcium to make it excited, make it positive. What happens is it sends a signal. But when we have excessive glutamate, or glutamate is constantly being released, as in concussions or anemias, depriving of oxygen, I'll tread lightly, certain vaccines have been shown to cause glutamate excitotoxicity. Other aspects of concussion, I already said, inflammation, those 5 factors that we talked about earlier influences this. So what happens then is the mitochondria in here, this is the key point, the mitochondria pump out calcium. So once the action potential has gone and sent out, the mitochondria does a really important job to making that cell negative again. So it doesn't want it to be positive. But what happens is with that excitotoxicity, the mitochondria get damaged because there is a release of something called protein kinase. This releases a series of steps called arachidonic acid. Then arachidonic acid releases reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species. These basically, it causes a bunch of inflammatory steps to damage the mitochondria. Now the mitochondria can no longer pump out calcium, so the cell becomes positive and more positive and more positive, and then basically that positivity causes the neuron to self-destruct. And that's how neurons die, so that neuroexcitotoxic effect. Go on next. And then, so now is where we'll kind of switch over to Alzheimer's and how that's connected, so and how Alzheimer's is developed. So Alzheimer's, there's a couple key components. So we have neurotropin receptors, which prevent cell death. We have antitropin receptors, such as our beta amyloid. If anyone's familiar with Alzheimer's, beta amyloid plaque is very common or highly talked about. This will induce cell death. Okay, but the thing here is we first have something called APP. This is a amyloid precursor protein. This sits on the neuron, okay? It sits on there and it talks to the environment. It's basically going to do 2 things. It's either going to grab something called netrin-1, and netrin-1 causes the APP to be cut at a single site, and it'll produce either soluble APP or alpha CTF. And this will create neurogenesis, it'll help the neuron grow, it will prevent apoptosis, it will prevent the cell from dying, and it will just create healthy structure. Now, once we start producing beta amyloid, the APP will get cut at 3 sites. If it's cut at the beta site, the gamma site, or the caspase site, it will produce these items here: soluble APP beta, JCASP, C31, and amyloid beta. If it's cut at those sites, that is the degrading, those are the degrading plaques that are essentially formed. And what happens is, if this is predetermined or shifts to cutting it at 3 sites, as we produce more amyloid beta, it will basically, there'll be more amyloid beta than netrin-1. If there's more amyloid beta, it's going to prefer to bind to that and create more of the harmful amyloid plaques. So we want to try to balance that distribution. So I know it gets a little scientific. I was just trying to create a connection there. We want it to cut at the 1 site rather than 3 sites. Okay? And how we do that is the 5 influences that we're going to talk about. On to the next. Okay, so here's the question at hand. Is this amyloid beta really is it an insult? Is it damaging? Because what's looked at, what some of the neuroscientists look at, is being a protective insult, meaning we're producing these beta plaques to sustain, priority, such as autonomic response to breathe, the ability to have long-term memory, the ability to have the autonomic response on how to chew your food versus what did I have for dinner last night? Who was the friend that I saw 2 months ago? What's their name? So really what's happening here is the body's innate ability to prioritize and say, we're going to destroy this so we can save ourselves to learn how to breathe, to learn how to talk, to keep learning those processes that we've learned a long time ago. So that's kind of something, we always kind of say that these are bad guys, mainly this one, but this is a really important process that is thought to actually help our maintain our primal functions. So what are some early signs? What should I be concerned about? So decreased processing speed, driving anxiety, forgetting the to-do list, mixing up words, sleep disruption is a really common one. No boost from caffeine anymore. Mental fatigue at the end of the day, decreased in pleasure in reading, forgetting the plot. Also facial recognition, you're not, there's someone's, I've seen that face before, but I haven't seen it. If you're really good with numbers, I'm not, but no longer being good with numbers. That's why I'm in the health field. So like no longer being able to do tasks that you want to, or learn skills that you mastered, unable to carry those skills through. Okay, so what are the 3 types of Alzheimer's? So there are 3 types. There's not just one. There's hot, which is known as inflammatory. There's 2, which is cold, more commonly known as atropic. And 3, which is toxic. We'll go into each one. So what is inflammatory? As it says, it's the driving process of inflammatory cascades. So this is loss of hippocampal volume. That's most commonly seen in Alzheimer's, is the loss of the hippocampal volume. In the temporal and parietal lobes, if you're doing like an MRI or a PET, the PET, you'll see the loss of glucose uptake, less activity. And then these are some of the markers that you'll notice. So we'll have an increased CRP, that's an inflammatory marker. We'll have a decreased albumin to globulin ratio, increased interleukin-6, increased tumor necrosis factor. We'll have increased insulin resistance, which will be seen through elevated glucose, elevated hemoglobin A1C, and elevated homocysteine levels. So if those are all out of range, very telltale sign for type 1 Alzheimer's. Then we have type 2, which is atropic. This is more along the lines with hormones and nutrient depletion. That's more of the issue here. So we have the this is more commonly, the first 2 are more common with the ApoE4 gene. Just real quick on that, with 1 and 2, if you have 1 copy, so you'll either have 1 or 2 copies of the 2 copies of the ApoE gene. Typically what it is if you have a 4, you have a 30% increased risk for Alzheimer's. If you have a 4 and a 4, it's greater than 50 risk for Alzheimer's. But I can't stress this enough. Just because we have a genetic predisposition doesn't mean all is lost. This is the analogy I like to say. It's a little violent, I guess, but your genes are the loaded gun, your environment is the trigger. So really, really important. Our genes aren't everything as long, if we have a good, healthy environment. So again, this is ApoE4. It increased your number, increased the risk number by typically 2 decades, occurs later in life. So this is going to be around in your 50s to 60s where it comes on. Type 1 around your 40s to 50s. And then type 3 is typically 70s to 80s. So some inflammatory markers may be negative. Imbalance in hormones. So this one is very tightly regulated with their hormones. You'll see reduced vitamin D. Insulin resistance may or may not be in this one. You'll have elevated homocysteine like the last one, but we'll also have elevated B vitamin markers, not just B12, but other various B vitamin markers.
Elevated or low?
Excuse me, low. Did I say
okay.
low? I'm looking at homocysteine, low, yep. So your B12, anything below 650, you want to be concerned about. Your B1, anything below, I believe it's 100 for your B1. B6, 10 to 25 is the range you want. Anything below 25 for B6 is no good. And then folate, you want your folate higher than 15. And then toxic. So this one's the harder one from research to remove. This is more common in your APO3, so this one doesn't really represent with the APOE4. It's not familial like the other two, typically of your familial history here. Symptoms can be as late to the 40s or 60s, but typically develops in the 80s here. Begins with cognitive difficulty, speech, numbers, poor coordination and organization. Many times it's accompanied with depression or anxiety. That's like the first indication there. This one will have increased phospho-tau in the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. They have abilities now to do tau MRIs, so that's a possibility to look into. Like we talked about, this one responds the worst. Usually misdiagnosed as frontotemporal dementia. And then a lot of the times we'll see low zinc, high copper ratios here. So your zinc to copper ratio, you typically want it to be 1:1. In this, we'll see higher copper ratio. The reason why that's bad, copper has an extra electron on its outer valence shell. And what it will do is it will go around and it'll basically, it can basically give an electron to another molecule and create a free radical. Free radical goes around and just creates damage. The reason why we want zinc, because zinc has an open space in its outer valence electron. So if it sees a free radical, it will grab it and absorb it and prevent it from damaging other molecules. So that's why we want to focus on zinc here and at least having at least a 1:1 ratio. This one will notice low triglyceride levels here compared to cholesterol. And then we'll have global brain atrophy, again, dealing with hormones, adrenal hormones, thyroid, increased reverse T3. So this one can influence our hormones as well, but mainly the atropic is hormone related. This is going to be your heavy metals, your mold, your virus, Lyme, mainly that's what it's going to be attributed to. Okay, so how do we treat this? How do we go about treating this? As we've already talked about, it's more than just a monotherapy. It's more than just using the 5 approved Alzheimer medications. So there's been over 240 FDA-run trials for Alzheimer medications. They only have approved 5 of them. And none of them are approved to reverse Alzheimer's. None of them cures it or reverse. They only slow the progression or they slow the decline of Alzheimer's. So it is no cure for a monotherapy. And the common ones, like we talked about, are memantine, which was the glutamate inhibitor, and then there is the I'm blanking on the second one. It'll come to me. But anyways, the important issue here, Dr. Bredesen talks about this, and I love this analogy. It's the multiple holes in the roof. So monotherapy is just covering one hole. Doesn't fix the problem of multiple holes. So we need to have a focus that fixes multiple holes here and it covers, the span of the roof instead of just fixing one hole. So first thing, which I love this, that Dr. Bredesen talks about is the cognoscopy. So we all have, the annual checkups that we're required to, but why not have a required cognoscopy? So that starts with a very simple test that anyone can do and administer, basically, as long as you have a little bit of knowledge. It's the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test. You typically want this test to be 26 or higher. This is the test on the right here, one of 3. They have 3 versions, so you don't, you can't ace it every time and remember it. So really good to have a baseline to know where you're at. The next thing to look at is genetic testing. If you want to get into that, these are the various genes that you'd want to test: the TREM2, APP, your presenilin 1, your presenilin 2, CR1, CD33, NLRP1, and ApoE. Now, if you're very concerned, I wouldn't say you have to take this step yet, but if there's a lot of things, your Montreal Cognitive Assessment test is low, you've done some genetic testing, you've done blood testing, and all of it is, not looking too good here, that's when I'd recommend doing the FDG PET scan or your MRI with volumetrics. These are going to be really important to look at. The first area that's affected is the mesotemporal lobe in the area. Typically, the cerebellum in Alzheimer's is typically left alone. So blood work. When we have multiple markers to look at blood work to properly indicate that we have at least cognitive impairment, whether it be mild or severe or actual Alzheimer development here. So as you can see, this is just a small bit of what we would run. To tie it in, there's a lot of pieces that are involved here. So we need to assess. So your ApoE, your inflammation, your CRP, these aspects that we've already talked about, making sure we at least get a baseline for where you're heading here. Okay, so what is our targeted treatment? What are we going to do? It's important to consider craniosacral therapy, acupuncture, consider hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We want to make sure we're doing good exercise, we're having good lifestyle management. Nutrition is a really important aspect. That's probably, I would highlight that if I could. Stress management, sleep is another highlighted key point. We want to make sure we balance our hormones. We address chemical stressors such as toxins. And then last on here, you can see, I probably think the smallest portion, supplementation and medication. So sleep. During sleep, we initiate autophagy. So this is basically, think of it as like the street sweeper coming by and cleaning the streets. It helps to clear out any damaged proteins or any damaged mitochondria and help recycle those parts and actually use them again with other cells. Sleep reduces amyloid plaque. During sleep, we fast, so we improve insulin sensitivity. Sleep increases growth hormone, which is going to help repair. And then making sure that if we're concerned about sleep apnea, we're getting that assessed. That's really important if we're depriving ourselves of oxygen here. So what you'd want to do, there's a lot of easy, accessible at-home sleep apnea tests. The most important thing you want to look at when you get that result back, there should be an apnea-hypoxia index. You want that less than 5 per hour, okay? So corrections, making sure we're looking at sleep hygiene, making sure we're not having the TV on, that we have darkening blinds, that we have either earplugs or some type of sound to make sure it's not you're gonna be woken up in the middle of the night. Making sure that if we are looking at a screen, that we have blue light blocker, so it's not stimulating the pineal gland to release melatonin. Making sure that we are just preparing ourselves for sleep. All of those aspects: comfortable temperature, comfortable bed, the must, what you should be doing. Making sure you don't have a phone next to your head, making sure the Wi-Fi is turned off. Those aspects are really important. Okay, targeted nutrition. So typically the best thought method is a ketogenic diet. The reason being because ketones burn the cleanest in the brain. There's a lot of controversy about certain areas needing glucose. Research coming out is showing that a high-fat diet, which is a ketogenic diet, is the most effective for neurogenesis here. So what a 16-3 diet means here. So typically it's rough. I would say at least 13 hours. I lean on the longer end of at least a 16-hour fast. So 13 to 16 hours. If you're doing a 16, what it looks like is you're stopping your food at either 7 or 8 o'clock, and then the next time you eat is at either 10 or 11. So if you stop at 8, 8 to 10. If you stop at 7, 7 to 11. We'll get you that 16-hour fast. 3-hour fast, the three here doesn't mean your eating window. It means you're stopping 3 hours from when you go to bed. No food 3 hours before you go to bed. Okay? And then as you can see here, I kind of put an asterisk next to the 4-4, the ApoE44. If you carry that gene, there's some information that says you shouldn't be having high saturated foods. So like your MCT oil, your coconut oil, those saturated fats, you want to try to avoid. It's been linked to increase the progression of Alzheimer's. So staying away from the saturated fats if you're an ApoE44. Grams of sugar, we want less than 15 grams. Obviously, insulin sensitivity is important here. So less than 15 grams. If you're following a ketogenic diet, you'd be right around 30 to 40 grams of carbohydrates per day. 1 kilogram of protein, 1 gram of protein per kilogram of your body weight. You want about 70% of your diet from fat. Again, I put an asterisk because we already talked about that, the saturated fats. And then if we consume our carbohydrates, we want to try to consume them in fiber form. Fiber is really helpful for absorbing glucose and making sure we don't drastically spike your blood sugar. And then obviously gluten-free. I don't think we have to talk about that. We should know that gluten irritates the digestive tract and it creates a lot of intestinal permeability there. But if you're on a ketogenic diet, you're on a gluten-free diet. Nutrition continued. So we want to make sure we have good detoxifying foods in our diet. What are those detoxifying foods? Broccoli, kale, radishes, Brussels sprouts, turnips, arugula, daikon, rapini, wasabi, bok choy, avocados, beets, ginger, dandelion, olive oil, seaweed. These are all very good detoxing foods that we should be consuming on a daily basis. Consuming some prebiotic and probiotic foods. A lot of your fiber foods will have these as well, but really important: sauerkraut, sour pickles, miso, kombucha, probiotics, kimchi, onion, garlic, jicama, raw leeks, artichoke, dandelion greens. These are all really important foods to be consuming. As we've already talked about, I think we're beating a dead horse here. Insulin, making sure that we are not having high levels of sugar, which drive high levels of insulin. If insulin's high, this is a really key point. If insulin's high, we need to release an enzyme to break down insulin. Simple enough, called insulin-degrading enzyme. But this insulin-degrading enzyme will also break down amyloid plaques. So if we have high circulating insulin, its main job is going to be, let's break down the insulin. I don't have time for those amyloid plaques. I need to do the insulin first. So if we can, let the insulin-degrading enzyme have some latitude, it's going to focus on degrading the amyloid plaques. We want our fasting insulin of 4 to 5 or less, fasting glucose less than 90, and our hemoglobin A1C of less than 5.8. I typically like to have it less than 5.5. Inflammation. So another aspect here to address. We want a CRP that's below 0.9. So typically 0.95 is what I shoot for. How does this influence inflammation? How's inflammation driven? Leaky gut, if we're eating gluten, if we're having high sugar, high trans fats, if there's toxins that we're unaware of, or infections. We want our ratio of albumin to globulin of at least 1.8. Again, that's going to be helpful for brain formation. We want a ratio of our omega-6 to omega-3 to be less than 3. I try to shoot for at least 1-to-1 for omega-6 to omega-3, but that's really hard to get to. Your IL-6 less than 3. Your oxidated LDL less than 16. TNF-alpha less than 6. These are all other inflammatory markers. So how do we take care of this? Other than making sure we have good diet, good sleep, taking something called SPMs, pro-resolving mediators is what they're called, is what it means. Turmeric, high-dose fish oil, these are all aspects that help address inflammation. Okay, hormones. So this was the aspect that I was like, well, how do hormones influence the brain? And sure enough, as I was just looking at, well, I'm like, well, you dummy, the brain receptors, you have the most receptors in your brain that talk to your hormones. So you have the hypothalamus that communicates to the gonads in the adrenal glands or the ovaries. It sends the signal for hormones to be produced. So really important that we have good brain health. And also APP is considered, so remember if we go back, we talked about APP with the cutting of different strands. Well, APP is considered a master receptor. And it actually is thought that all other receptors, your hormone receptors such as testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, they all communicate and report basically back to APP. So if the receptors are being downregulated or we don't have the correct hormone balance, it's reporting back to APP and it's causing it to now be cut in the three pattern instead of the one pattern. So that's how it kind of ties in, which I thought was pretty amazing that it could do that. So we'll move on to our next slide. So thyroid, it's metabolically active in all cells, so all cells need thyroid to function. It controls our temperature, our heart rate. If we have sleep issues, very much can be driven by our thyroid and can drive mild cognitive impairment, MCI. Measurements we want to look at. So we don't want to look at just TSH. That's pretty much what a lot of practitioners run, and that's we need more than that. As you can see, we have our free T3, free T4, total T3, total T4, reverse T3, TPO, thyroid peroxidase antibody, thyroglobulin antibody. So there's definitely more. Labs and corrections here. So this just kind of tells you what the range is. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but your TSH should be at least like the healthy range is 1.8. So if you can get a TSH of 1.8, you're doing great. If you can get a free T3 of 3.5, you're doing great. If you can get a free T4 of 1.5, you're doing great. Those are really important to look at. So how do we correct that? Other than medications such as your levothyroxine, your Armour, your NP thyroid, your Nature Throid, those are medications that you can take. But using iodine, using selenium, using glandular products to help improve that thyroid function. And also looking in making sure we address the adrenals, because the adrenals and the thyroid are tightly regulated on the same axis. Estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen cleaves APP. Remember that it cleaves it in the one spot. We talked about that already, which prevents dementia. Low estrogen may double your risk of dementia. Estradiol goals 50 to 250. Progesterone 1 to 20. Estradiol progesterone ratio 10 to 100. So we want estradiol to be 10, progesterone to be 100. At the very least, you want your E to P ratio 1 to 25. So how do we correct this? There's some, I would say some backlash on doing hormone, HRT, hormone replacement therapy on, typically the cutoff is like 40 to 50. There's a little bit of back and forth if, someone who's 60, 70 should be getting HRT. But at the end of the day, your hormones need to be balanced. We need to try to stabilize those. Indirect connections that we talked about, your adrenals are tightly regulated to your sex hormones, making sure the adrenals are good, and taking various herbs such as chasteberry or using like bacopa is helpful. There's some other herbs that we can use to balance our hormones. Testosterone. So men with low testosterone increase risk to Alzheimer's. The optimal testosterone, total testosterone, is 500 to 1,000. Your free testosterone, 6.5 to 15. I I'd like for it to be 16 or and higher, but that may be tough to get there. How do we correct that? We can use DHEA. We can use chrysin, which is an herb that helps to increase testosterone. And again, indirect connections. Taking care of the adrenals. Adrenals tie into our androgens. And then we can use medications such as testosterone not occurring. Our adrenal hormones, as I've kind of harped on here, how they influence our estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone as well. Short term, if we're under stress, that's okay. But as long as we correct the hormone production from the adrenals in chronic stress. We don't want to be under chronic stress in affecting that. So cortisol AM, this is your cortisol in the morning, should be anywhere from 10 to 18. If it's higher than 18, you need to be worried about possible infections driving that cortisol response. If it's less than 10, you need to find out why that's going on there. Are we at risk for Addison's, which is really, really low cortisol? DHEA, for women, we want 350 to 430, men 400 to 500. Pregnenolone, we want 50 to 100. This is neuroprotective, really, really important, supports memory. So a lot of people miss this marker. So corrections, we can actually give you pregnenolone, we can give you DHEA, we can give you licorice root to help raise up your cortisol. We can give adaptogens, which will help raise up cortisol. Okay, looking at metals. So now we're kind of getting into the toxic here, which is stage 3. So we talked about low zinc being a risk factor for dementia. Most Americans are zinc deficient in copper excess. Remember, copper is going to go and create more free radicals, more of a, it wants to make a mess. So we don't want that. Zinc is critical for insulin synthesis. So making sure we don't have high insulin, how we break down insulin, zinc can help in that process. Quarter of the population is zinc deficient. That's pretty scary. Copper and zinc compete with one another. So again, really important we're consuming zinc. We talked about this already, 1-to-1 ratio. If we want to figure out how free copper, this is just an equation on how to figure out what your free copper is. We want it to be less than 30. Your red blood cell zinc should be 12 to 14. And then correction. So how do we correct this? I want you to consume zinc. We use binders such as charcoals, bentonite clay. We can use detoxifying agents, which we talked about, the nutrition, as well as using glutathione or various sulfur amino acids to help phase 1 and phase 2 detox. Okay, chemical stressors here. So we talked about metals, the cadmium, arsenic, lead, mercury, those issues. We're going to talk about molds quickly here, molds and mycotoxins. So making sure, how do we address for this? So there's the Great Plains mycotoxin panel. It's a urine panel to assess for mycotoxins. How do we assess for it in the home? The gold standard is an ERMI, so it's a ERMI score. I always call it ERMI, ERMI. Okay, so it stands for relative mold index. I'm not sure I'm blanking on the E, I apologize, but it's ERMI, ERMI index. You want it less than 2 in your home. If it's above 2, Dr. Shoemaker thinks that you need to do mold remediation. Okay, so again, that's ERMI, ERMI. Your bacteria, we want to make sure we assess for various bacteria. We want to make sure we assess for various viruses. We want to assess for spirochetes. So that means Lyme and Lyme co-infections, Bartonella, Babesia, Ehrlichia, other issues that are with a spirochete. We want to be aware of drugs. Some drugs are negative against or impact negatively our brain development. Those being our benzodiazepines, our antidepressants, our Valium, our PPIs or our H2 blockers, which block acid secretion. So being aware of those. Obviously, reduce smoking and alcohol consumption. Being aware of cosmetic agents in hygiene products. So using Environmental Wellness Group, it's an app. You just search EWG. You can scan a product and it gives you like basically how toxic that product is. Making sure you're trying to avoid parabens, trying to avoid aluminum, pretty common things here for using those products. And then food sensitivities. Are we gluten sensitive? I hope we're avoiding gluten. Are we dairy sensitive? Are we sensitive to corn, to soy, to pork? Figuring out what those sensitivities are. And then I left this last because again, I think the other aspects we talked about are really what we need to own before even looking at this. So supplementation, really good things we want to make sure we at least have is good vitamin D status, essential for maintaining brain synapses. Our goal is 50 to 90, optimal 80. That's your blood marker that we want for your vitamin D. Glutathione quenches free radicals and chelates out heavy metals, really important. So we want greater than 250 for your glutathione, your blood marker. Then we want resveratrol. Resveratrol has been shown to activate sirtuin-1 signaling. So that's basically a molecule of longevity. It's a molecule of healthy aging. So consuming at least 100 milligrams one time a day of resveratrol, at least. I would recommend a little bit higher than that. And then these are some other supplements that you can take. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just comment on a couple here, like your B vitamins. So your B1, 50 milligrams. Your B6. Make sure you take it in a P5P form. So just make sure if you look on the back of your B vitamin, it should say P5P. It's a methylated form. You want to take it in the active form. Make sure your folate, it's methylated as well. Make sure your B12 is methylated as well. So it should say methylfolate for your folate, and it should say methylcobalamin for your B12. Those are really important aspects. Some other things here that are really helpful for brain development. Ubiquinol, 100 milligrams, I'm just going to point out. PQQ, pyrrolquinone. I butchered that, but PQQ, 10 to 20 milligrams. That I thought are very helpful. Your Bacopa monnieri, 250 milligrams, 2 times a day. Your Gotu-Kola, 500 milligrams, 2 times a day. Lion's mane is really helpful. We're going to be taking that 500 milligrams, 2 times a day. So these are aspects that really helpful in brain development. You can read the rest here. If we're dealing with insulin resistance, another good thing is zinc, chromium, cinnamon. About a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon daily is helpful. Those are some aspects if we're dealing with insulin resistance. ALA is alpha lipoic acid, not alpha linolenic acid. So alpha lipoic, just so you're aware of that, 60 milligrams. And that's it for the supplementation. Okay, so food for thought. Just remember, we should be training the brain. We should always be training the brain. So some good things here are luminosity or brain HQ, and trying to shoot for 30 minutes 3 times a day if you can. If not, 10 minutes here and there. If you can get that brain training in, that'd be very helpful. And then I had to kind of be on my soapbox for this one, because a lot of the times we put such an emphasis on total cholesterol being as low as possible. From a cardiovascular standpoint, the cardiovascular doctor would probably be tickled pink if they had a total cholesterol of 0. It's been shown that total cholesterol of less than 150 causes brain atrophy, meaning the brain actually shrinks. So, let's not be so focused on trying to get that cholesterol so low, but let's at least try to focus on, greater than 150. Got to make sure we talk about exercise. Exercise reduces insulin. It increases BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor. Actually makes the brain grow. Increases vascular function. It improves sleep, improves stress and mood. I recommend 4 to 5 days a week of 30 to 45 minute exercise. And probably somewhere with, if you want to track your heart rate, I would probably say anywhere from 60 to 70% of your heart rate max. So how do you figure that out? You take your age, you minus from 220, that's your cap. That's the highest. That's 100% of heart rate max. So you take that number and then you can times it by 0.7 to get 70% of that, if that makes sense. Doing meditation, focusing on some calming actions. You know, we're always on the go, 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 go. You know, try to take a minute out of the rat race and, you know, just doing some meditation. I use Headspace. It's a really good app. You can even choose if you can do 2 minutes, 5 minutes, or 10 minutes of meditation. And it's, you know, I enjoy it. It's helpful. And then I need to give credit here. This was from one of the leading researchers, neuroscience researcher in the world right now, Dr. Dale Bredesen. Very good book. A lot of the information was from there, with our twist. So this is kind of a 2-slide here. So if we went back, you know, and said we're never going to land on the moon, right? People would think we're nuts if we said we're gonna land on the moon. We're gonna actually plant a flag. We would be nuts. Same aspect. We talk about today. We say we are here. Our goal is to reverse and prevent Alzheimer's. Right now, that's considered, you know, to be nutty right now. So where there is hope, there is healing. So do not lose hope. Just like when we never thought we landed on the moon, now we're taking regular trips to space. So now today in the era, we can't heal or prevent or reverse Alzheimer's. Do not lose hope.